Well, nowadays there are many new areas of investment, especially renewable energy, for example, is something which is blooming all across the country, all across the world, including emerging markets. And lots of developing countries, emerging markets, they are actually happen to be having lots of sun, and most of them having a lot of wind. And especially if these projects are made by some support of the governments, like long-term credibility, assistance of the government somehow in some shape, then these also provide a huge new opportunity. So yes, the deglobalization is a reality, but when we look at the investments as long-term investments, not just short-term in and out, short-term opportunity, but long-term investments, then overall, the growth rate of the developing countries will be higher than the developed countries. So if the countries are chosen in a wise way, if you don't put all the eggs in one basket but diversify enough, so in the long term, on average, the investments in the developing world will have higher returns than the investments in the developed world. So that's, I think, very important for long-term view. Of course, there will be ups and downs. Emerging markets means risks. It means volatility. It means political instability from time to time, and it's in the very nature of it. But then, when you have that long-term vision, it's a win-win outcome. For renewables, by the way, for renewable energy, which is very, very important to reach the 2050 targets of net zero emissions, there's not enough financing yet. I mean, I happen to be in the 2015 group of UN for Sustainable Development Goals, 2030 goals. I also happen to be in the G20 eminent persons group for how to finance. But still, to reach the 2030 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the money is not there, and it is underinvested. And it is not going to be there. It is going to be a dream to reach the 2030 or the 2050 targets if we look at the financing for renewables as of now. So decarbonization investment is also a very important area, and how to finance it has to go through unorthodox mechanisms. The orthodox mechanisms is not working for financing decarbonization. And here, again, reserve currency issuing central banks should have a role. Because the currency they issue will not be worth a lot if our sons and grandsons don't live in a world where everyone is suffering. So it's time to use the powers of the central bank in a wise way, in a very targeted way, for financing decarbonization, for financing renewables, but it has to be done in a also globally coordinated way, so it's not misused, because when the central bank opens doors, of course, there will be lots of people demanding any kind of thing, but it should be strictly limited to decarbonization for renewable energy, and those specially opened central bank windows should be directed for financing. Otherwise, 2030 targets, impossible to reach. 2050 targets, impossible to reach.
But fundamentals, suddenly those fundamentals are being questioned in Turkey. Add to that the risk from the looming election. How should investors be looking at the potential and the risks in Turkey?
Well, we have elections on 14th of May, and I am the leader of one of the opposition parties. And what we are going to see before the elections would be probably more of populist approach. That's inevitable. But then for after elections, if there's a change of a government, and it is very likely to be so, then probably there should be an expectation for better human resources and a more rational approach of what is being done on economic and financial management side. But just not for Turkey, but for many developing countries, what is, at the end of the day, what's important is a rule-based approach when it comes to policy set. We have mainly 4 areas, right? The monetary policy, fiscal policy, macroprudential measure area, and the structural reforms. For the first three areas, for the monetary policy, a rule-based approach for central banks is very important to bring credibility, which means under which circumstances, what kind of an action the central bank will do, and announcing this to provide also a forward guidance for the markets that under each scenario, what kind of acts the central bank will do. And pre-announcing this is going to give very important guidance. And for the fiscal policy, fiscal rule is very important for the developing countries. It's difficult. Even the Eurozone came up with a fiscal rule after 2008-2009 crisis. They had to come up with a fiscal rule. But having a fiscal rule is also very important for developing countries to bring predictability to the business world and markets. And then macroprudential measures, using the banking regulation in order to tighten or loosen credit availability. Of course, it's a very complicated area. There are many, many tools that you can use in that area. But again, a rule-based approach for macroprudential measure set is very important. So if there's a rule-based approach for monetary policy, fiscal policy, and macroprudential measure set, this will bring a huge amount of predictability about what will the government do, what will the central bank do, under which circumstances. But the big problem about a rule-based approach is the fact that the political leaders sometimes don't want to be bound by rules. They want to have always choices in front of them. But it's a choice between vulnerability, volatility, versus stability. Yes, it limits the choices, but at the end of the day, it benefits the country.
Ali, your thoughts? Have we seen the worst? Is the worst over for emerging markets? I mean, we talk about inflation. Turkey is suddenly one country that's looking at tremendously high inflation. 80% easing to 60%, it's still 60%.
Well, when we look at the last 20 years, there has been two periods of boost about the size of the balance sheets of the currency issuing central banks. The first boost was in 2008-2009 crisis, and the second boost of the balance sheets were in the pandemics during the COVID crisis, so to say. And so much liquidity at such a low price was not a sustainable thing. And finally, it hit the inflation, and central banks did the inevitable. I think it was important for the central banks to preemptively provide liquidity, because the pandemic could have made a huge impact in the global economy. So it was mostly prevented. But now it's time to just keeping acts together and normalize the things. Of course, this does have spillover effects to the emerging markets, developing countries. There could be future spillback effects to the developed world also. Of course, the emerging markets, developed countries, have to be very, very careful about what they are doing. For us, the monetary policy have been too loose for such a long time, and negative interest rates was too big. So that did have an additional impact on our domestic inflation. But then these are all reversible things. I mean, like former crisis, previous crisis, if the governments and the central banks take wise actions, inflation is not a dragon which you cannot fight with or something like that. You can deal with this. But most important element missing, which we have been observing over the last 1 year period, is lack of adequate coordination and cooperation across the countries. And G20 here is very much underutilized. G20 is a setup where 2/3 of the world population is represented, 75% of world trade is represented, and 85% of the global GDP is represented. And all the continents are represented. African Union is there, European Union is there. So in these very special circumstances, it is very, very important for G20 to come together more often. And now the digital availability is everywhere. And we all got used to using Zoom or WebEx, whatever platform it is. So G20 should meet more often to coordinate policies across the countries, so that the reserve currency issuing central banks don't think that it is their only country or it is just the Eurozone, but it is the whole global village that we are living in. So more policy coordination is a must. And for the problems about Turkey, these are all easy to solve. It just takes just good human resources, rational decisions to do it, and I believe that these could be fixed very soon. And Turkish economy also showed that there is the underlying resilience going on. Although we had lots of geopolitical issues, we are highly dependent on oil and gas imports. We happen to be in the middle of every single moving things across our neighborhood, but still on top of all these, the underlying resiliency is there. With better decisions, better actions, better being connected to the rest of the world, these are issues that can be overcome easily.